Hello everyone and welcome. In games like role-playing games, for example, you will usually have a sort of Gambeson in the game as an armor. So whether that's called Gambeson, Akiton, or more commonly padded armor, but you will only have one of these armors. Potentially two, you might have like a thick and a thinner version, but that's about how much difference there is between different sorts of Gambesons in a certain game. In reality, obviously, the thickness of the Gambeson will change how much it protects you, and obviously the style of Gambeson. So if you have a long-sleeved Gambeson, a short-sleeved Gambeson, that will change how much it protects you. And of course, you can have things like Gambeson coifs, basically, that will clearly not protect the rest of your body, only the head. So these things definitely change how a Gambeson functions. However, these games are very often misleading in the way that they make us believe that a Gambeson is one specific kind of armor. That's not actually true. In reality, a Gambeson is a whole category of different sorts of fabric armors. Now, these fabric armors will always have some padding and be made of fabric, but they can be made in a lot of different ways and with a lot of different materials. So, in this video, what we're going to do is to go through all of these different ways of making a Gambeson and all of the different materials you can use to make a Gambeson and find out what are the advantages and disadvantages of each of them. So, let's start with the first way of making a Gambeson, which probably most people are the most familiar with, and that is the stuffed Gambeson. So basically, you will have two pieces of fabric, and the area in between these two piece of fabric will be stuffed with something. Now that something can really be just anything that is relatively soft. Usually what was most commonly used would be like wool in its just natural state right from the sheep. Horsehair could be used, or you could also use something like flax or something like that. You could also use cotton if you had access to it, because of course it wasn't necessarily too accessible everywhere in the world, because it only grows in certain places of the world. And finally, you could also use like straw or something like that. It wasn't commonly done, but you could use some kind of straw. But yeah, you could really just put anything that was like relatively soft in there. I forgot to mention, but like pieces of like rags basically were often used to really just anything that is soft and that will add some padding. Now that kind of Gambeson, so the stuffed Gambeson, is okay against cuts, but isn't ideal. It is mostly a Gambeson that you're going to try to use under other sorts of armor, so for example mail or plate armor. You're usually not going to use it as a standalone armor because it's not ideal against cuts. A cut will struggle relatively to cut through a piece of fabric, at least if it's not very sharp, but the stuffed Gambeson only has two pieces of fabric, and then it's stuffed with something that is relatively easy to cut through. However, it is pretty good against blunt force. It's probably one of the best sorts of Gambeson to use against blunt force, and that is also a reason why it was so used under other armors, because what you usually want from a Gambeson under another armor is for the Gambeson to act basically like a pillow protecting from the blunt force. And on top of that, the stuffed Gambeson is relatively light because the material that you put inside between the two pieces of fabric is relatively soft and not very dense. Now, the first evidences we have of this sort of Gambeson, the stuffed Gambeson, comes from a place in France called Bussy-Saint-Martin. They basically found a piece of a Gambeson there, I think it was a sleeve, made of this kind of stuffed Gambeson. And that piece of Gambeson is dated to in between the 1160 and 1270. So it is a relatively like modern piece of armor. Now, do remember that we're talking about a fabric armor, so it will not be preserved too long through time. So it is perfectly possible that this kind of Gambeson existed before, only we haven't really found it because, well, it's fabric, it rots away very easily. Now, the next way of making a Gambeson is by layering a lot of different pieces of fabric. So instead of having two pieces of fabric and stuffing something between them, you're actually going to use a lot of pieces of fabric. And this is going to make for a Gambeson that is way better against cuts, because, as I said, for a weapon to cut through a piece of fabric, it is relatively hard. Like, it's going to do it, especially if it's sharp, but it takes some effort, and especially if the weapon isn't too sharp, it can take some cutting distance to actually do it. So that layered Gambeson is actually probably one of the best Gambesons against cuts. However, it is much worse against blunt force, because now you're talking about a lot of layers of a certain fabric, so you're going to have a relatively hard Gambeson through which force can transfer much more easily. It is basically not acting as much as a pillow as the stuffed Gambeson. And on top of that, is also much heavier, generally speaking. Depends on the thickness, of course, but generally speaking, it's much heavier than the stuffed Gambeson. Now, the first traces we have of this kind of Gambeson are from the 12th century, from like Frankish countries. So again, relatively modern. Now, clearly, this sort of Gambeson probably did exist long before, only we haven't really heard of it. The Romans had that sort of Gambeson-ish thing, we don't really know how it was made, called the suba malis, which was probably made in a relatively similar manner, only we can't know for sure because they never specified how they actually made it. They're only saying that it is a armor made to add padding made of fabric and also sometimes leather. But they're never specifying exactly how they made it, so we can't actually know. These ways of making them is only how we know they made them for sure. You might have had other ways of making them that we don't know of. And finally, the last sort of Gambeson is a Gambeson made either of thick fabric or of felt. This particular Gambeson here is made of felt. So if you look closely, this is felt. Now, this kind of Gambeson is pretty good against cuts, probably not as good as like layered fabric, because it's not exactly the same, but it is really good against cuts, especially compared to something like a stuffed Gambeson. This particular one is stuffed, and it is pretty okay against blunt force. It's not as bad as the layered one, but it's still not as good as the stuffed one, because there still is like some padding from like the thick fabric, but not as much as you get from the stuffing on the stuffed Gambeson. However, this Gambeson here, so either thick fabric or like felt, especially felt actually, is really good to keep the warmth, which can be good. It really depends on the climate. Of course, if you're in a hotter climate, it's only bad. But if you're in a colder climate, having that extra warmth can actually be a really good thing. And we actually see this sort of Gambeson made out of either felt or thick fabric becoming more popular in the north of Europe, so like Scandinavia. Like the Vikings, like Gambesons they used were made of like either felt or thick fabric. Now, they didn't really use straight up Gambesons. We don't usually call them Gambeson too much, even though, like, I personally think that it's not a problem calling them Gambesons, because it still is a sort of Gambeson if they are used to fight with. But usually we call them more like just woolen coats, because their primary function was to protect against cold. But they are constructed in the same manner as a Gambeson made of like thick fabric, and the reason why they chose to either use like thick fabric or felt was because it's very good to protect against the cold. Now, the first traces we have of this kind of Gambeson made of thick fabric is from the 4th century, from a Roman armor called the Thoracumacus, which is basically like probably just a very similar armor to the suba malis. We don't exactly know, because we don't exactly know how the suba malis was made, but it is a very similar armor, same function to be used like as padding under other armors primarily. And these are the 3 primary ways you can make a Gambeson. Maybe there are some more, that we haven't really discovered yet. As I said, we don't really know exactly how the suba malis was made, so maybe it was made in a completely different way, or maybe it was made in one of these ways. We can't exactly know, at least for now. And you can also notice that the dates of appearance I gave for these Gambesons are like 12th century, and 4th century. Clearly, they did have some form of padding under the armors before that time, only we don't exactly know how these were made. Maybe they were made in the same kind of way, like the suba malis appeared like around the 1st century before Common Era, so before these dates that are given here, and they also probably had some kind of padding under, like the bronze cuirasses of the Greeks. They didn't wear them straight up on a tunic. They had some form of padding on the inside. How it was made, we don't know. So like the 4th, 12th, and 12th century are only like the first traces we have of these Gambesons that we know for sure are exactly this kind of Gambeson. But it is very hard to know things about Gambesons in general because they are fabric armors. So it's not very easy to find like archaeological traces of them because they just rot away. Now, the way the Gambeson is constructed isn't the only factor to how much it will protect you. You also have the material used. So, usually Gambesons in Europe would probably be made mostly out of linen and wool. There are some examples made out of cotton, and some parts of the Gambeson could be made of cotton, but cotton was kind of rare because it didn't really grow in, like, at least the northern part of Europe. So if you wanted cotton, you actually probably had to import it from further south, which was just more expensive and wasn't necessarily worth it for a Gambeson. Now, linen is probably the toughest of these materials and will probably be the one to resist cuts the best. So if you want a Gambeson to protect you against cuts, that's probably the best option. And then you have wool. Now, wool is also pretty good to protect against cuts, probably not as good as linen, but still pretty good. It will also offer a little bit more protection against blunt force, and primarily it will be warmer, which can or cannot be desirable, depending on the climate. And finally, you have cotton. Now, cotton is probably the worst of the materials you use to resist cuts, but it is probably one of the best to protect against blunt force. Now, obviously, the exact material you use will probably not matter too much in something like a stuffed Gambeson, because you only have 2 layers of fabric, but it will matter more in something like a layered Gambeson, or in something like this with like felt or something like that. So, all of this means that you can create a Gambeson specifically for one purpose. You obviously have the thickness that will change a whole lot. You also have like exactly how it's designed, if it has long sleeves and stuff like that. And you have the way it's constructed, and you have the material used. And that way you can kind of create a Gambeson ideal for one specific thing. And if you take something like a Viking like Gambeson, it will usually be better against protecting against the cold. So this one is like a Haithabu kaftan, so it is like a specific kind of like Viking Gambeson, and it is made of felt, wool felt, and it has like long sleeves, is long and stuff like that. So it is ideal to protect against the cold. However, if you want a Gambeson that's ideal to protect against cuts, and that doesn't need to be so warm, even potentially better that it isn't so warm, you can make a Gambeson made out of layers of linen that will be ideal to protect against cuts. And if you want a Gambeson to protect against blunt force, you can have like a cotton stuffed Gambeson. That would probably be ideal, and then you can kind of mix things together to get an ideal armor for what you want. So, in a certain kind of way, one Gambeson will not protect you in a certain kind of way. It will just depend on the exact type of Gambeson you're using, because the Gambeson is just a category of different fabric armors that can be made in different ways and stuff like that. Now, obviously, for like games like role-playing or something like that, it can be complicated to implement these elements, and also it can make it completely complicated. So I wouldn't necessarily say that they should do that, but the way they're doing it now can be a bit misleading, so that's why I wanted to make this video, just show you that actually Gambeson is just a category of different fabric armors. And also, if you're seeing like tests, for example on YouTube, where they are testing a certain kind of Gambeson, the problem is that most like modern made Gambesons will usually be made out of cotton and will be stuffed Gambesons. So they will be one of the worst sorts of Gambesons to protect against cuts, and probably most other Gambesons will be way better to protect against cuts. If I take this one, I'm pretty sure like a lot of swords or axes or something like that will actually struggle to pierce these Gambesons, especially with like a cut or like a slash. Probably not with a thrust. Like a thrust will probably pierce it pretty easily. But there is a lot of difference between how much it protects, and all of this is important to take into consideration. So, as I said, a Gambeson is not one armor, it is a category of different sorts of fabric armor with different properties. Anyways, hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.